Agencies Drinking Beer is brought to you by Proposify, software that helps you deliver beautiful proposals in the cloud and close more deals.
Welcome to the 47th episode of Agencies Drinking Beer. On today's show, we're chatting with Paul Boag, a digital designer and consultant based out of the UK. In part one of this two-part series, Paul is going to teach us how he built his personal brand and how you can too. Paul.
Boy, you just have Paul in the mind.
He's so dreamy.
Man crush over there.
Yeah, a little bit of a man crush. No, Paul's one of my professional heroes, I would say.
You've been talking about him almost as long as I've known you.
It's true, when he's finally here on the show.
Amazing.
I think I make him feel uncomfortable.
He's a modest man.
Yeah, he's very modest. He's very self-deprecating, as the English sometimes are.
Not always, but sometimes.
Not always, but it is kind of an English thing, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's been kind of left over into Canada too. It's kind of...
It's true, we haven't. Did you see John Oliver did a thing on Justin Trudeau? He's our prime minister, and I'm not sure if you've heard, you've heard about it, Kevin, I know, but I don't know if the listeners have heard about it, where Justin Trudeau, our prime minister, accidentally elbowed somebody in Parliament. And my God, you think it was a sex scandal.
It wasn't an elbow, though, like a real elbow. It was a brush up against someone with their elbow.
It was an accident. He accidentally backed up while there was sort of commotion going on. He was trying to grab somebody else and lead them through the crowd where they were being blocked. And he backed up and sort of accidentally elbowed this MP in the boob. I said boob. So anyway, it's my point in saying this is that he's apologized profusely several times, and John Oliver's just sort of making fun of how often he's apologizing, how Canadian we are. And he talked about on the anniversary of when he gave another apology, sort of on behalf of some group that I'm sure were discriminated against. Justin Trudeau gave an apology on behalf of Canada. And so marking the apology for his apology, he apologized again for elbowing this person in the boob.
Are you going to apologize for him apologizing so much?
I think so, maybe.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So anyway, sorry, Paul, if I made you uncomfortable, because I think you're really smart and I like you. Okay.
All right, let's move on.
So before we get into this interview with Paul, I want to tell you a little story. It's about a friend who shall remain nameless. He's been growing his agency over the last couple of years, just from being his own sole freelance thing to having staff. And he's kind of my you'll know who I'm talking about. He's sort of my style guru. I get some good style advice from him on certain things, and maybe even advice on dating. And sort of, I guess, in return, I give him a little bit of business advice because I've just had a few more years on him in the experience department. And so I sometimes challenge him, and I'll say, you're doing these marketing jobs. How do you know they're profitable? And he just says I know you're going to give me shit for this, but I don't, I just feel it. I feel it in my gut. I'm like, are you tracking time? Do you have any KPIs you use? And he's like, kind of, sort of, not really. So that was kind of what inspired this blog post that I wrote a few weeks back at the beginning of May called 7 Metrics Every Profitable Agency Measures and Optimizes. Now, I don't know if every agency would necessarily measure these, but I just think this would be sort of the ideal metrics you would look at, and maybe there's more, not an exhaustive list. So I'm gonna run through a few of them and just see what you think, Kevin. So number of pre-qualified leads. Is that something you measure? Your pipeline, basically.
Yeah, of course. You have to keep track of it, and you have to constantly fill it and make sure that you have, you got to look at your percentage of close to your ratio of how much you're putting into the funnel. Mm-hmm. It's very important.
Exactly.
It's law of averages.
Yeah. If you know your close rate, that is the amount of proposals you send versus the amount of proposals you win, well, whatever, the percentage that you win, that's your close rate. So then you can kind of look at your lead funnel, assuming you're validating your leads and you're not taking everybody that comes knocking, you're not counting those as a lead. You're only counting ones that you're actually going to write a proposal for. Then you can get a pretty accurate sense of what you're going to close in the next 30, 60 days.
Yep.
Hopefully not longer than that, although 90-day closing is not unheard of, unfortunately. No. So that's one metric that you would look at. And one thing I kind of mentioned in the post is the size of the pipeline isn't as important as your close rate, because you can have this big giant pipeline with like $1 million in the funnel, but if your close rate's really low, I'd rather have a smaller pipeline and a higher close rate, because you're going to be spending less effort on those leads. You're not going to be writing as many proposals, for example.
Yeah, I don't want to bring up RFPs again, but that's a prime example of a huge funnel. Because if you go on Merck's or any of those, I mean, there's so many RFPs to respond to. You could just do that full time around the clock.
Yeah.
Your percentage is going to be so low, though.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's just a waste.
And this ties into it as well. Something that, pardon me, most every company really needs to measure. I don't know if they all do. Is their customer acquisition cost, their CAC.
Yes.
And you measure it a lot in SaaS because it's kind of easier. You can more easily tell how you get customers. Not as easy in an agency, but I think it's still something it's worth measuring is, how long are your salespeople spending on leads? How, are you flying the team out, across to taking 2-hour flight for your team? I mean, maybe that'll increase your close rate, but if the acquisition's too high, that project better be pretty.
We had a sales guy that bumped that up quite a bit with a lot of lunches.
His lunch budget was just through the roof. So I mean, the way that you would measure that customer's acquisition cost is all your salespeople who their time is dedicated to sales. What are their salaries and commission, and then maybe any marketing budget stuff like ads or whatever. And then combine that total in a 30-day period, divide that by how many new customers you get. So let's say your sales and marketing costs are $75,000. Divide that, let's say you get 8 new clients that month, then each client would have cost you $9,375 to acquire. So then of course you have to make sure you max that out in terms of lifetime value over the course of their lifetime. So that bringing to lifetime value. Now, this was interesting because we always think of lifetime value in SaaS, right? Let's say the average customer stays with you 12 months and they spend $100 a month. Just say 12 months, that would be a $1,200 lifetime value. One thing that was interesting was this case study, which I linked to in the post on Starbucks. What do you think their lifetime value is for a customer? It's a really cool kind of infographic because it kind of walks through how they would measure their lifetime value. So it ends up being something like $20,000 is their lifetime value for a customer. So, they can afford to spend a certain amount of money on marketing and sales because they know that over the course of that lifetime of that customer, they'll bring in $20,000 each.
Plus, I mean, their product, you get addicted to it.
Yeah.
So when you have a product like that, it's nice to keep people coming back.
Yeah, exactly. So then, lifetime value factors in because let's say that initial cost to acquire customers, that $9,000, and then you've still got to do, let's say, a project or fulfill a service or whatever. So how do you make that profitable? If you've got really good retention and you can keep the customer a long time and maximize the revenue you get out of them, then maybe you don't even make money on that first project, right? You try to, of course, you hope you do, but at the same time, you don't, if you're blowing through clients like, sell a project, do a project, they're not overly happy, the service wasn't that great, they move on, you've got to keep, filling that funnel full of new clients. The stat that I found was 5 to 20% likely to acquire a new client, whereas you're 60 to 70% more likely to get a new project or sale from an existing client.
Yeah, exactly.
4 times more likely. Or actually, it's 4 times the cost to acquire a new client.
Yep, I've heard
so that's something you think about. Now, the one thing that, the other thing that you could kind of get into a little bit here is like utilization rate, which it might make more sense if you look at the post because it's got graphs and stuff. But it's basically, let's say your employee works 40 hours a week. How much of that week can you actually bill for clients? And then when you look at that on an average level across all your employees, what's your average company utilization rate? Is that 90% of their time is billable, 75%, and so on? And obviously that's important for making sure your profit margins are healthy. I've heard that a 20% profit margin on an agency is actually amazing.
I could see that.
And that's pretty narrow, right?
Yeah.
So, let's say you do $1 million a year, it costs you to run your business, but the business generates $1,200 in expenses. Now, of course, there's taxes and all that stuff, but that would be considered a healthy profit margin.
Right.
I don't know. It's still pretty narrow.
It's narrow, but that's the service business.
I suppose it makes sense because then, if you're running $1 million or $1,200 or $1.2 million a year business, it's probably okay. You can, if you're a single founder, maybe make a decent living from that. But I think the ones that kill it are the ones that can turn that into like a $10 million a year business, or say $12 million, and they're, $2 million of that a year is profit. That's pretty healthy.
That's nice.
Yeah. So these are some. The last thing I just sort of want to go over is the hourly rate target. Yeah. Which is, do you know what your break-even rate is? Because if you figure, okay, this project, there's been lots of changes and we've been doing stuff out of scope, and now if you sort of break it down, we're basically working for $90 an hour. That might sound like a lot, but then if you take all your expenses and divide it up and figure out how much does it actually cost you an hour to run your business, then you might find that even though you're like, at least it's $90 an hour, you're still running at a loss. So you need to find out what that break even is. So, using an example in this post is taking all your expenses, combining it with your utilization rate, and then going, okay, so $104 an hour is break even. If that's what we average in that month across all of our billable employees, we didn't make any money, but we didn't lose any money. So it kind of makes you think more about, this is why you need to charge a lot more money.
And be more selective.
Exactly.
Yep.
And if you can get away with, let's say your break even's 100 an hour, then, if you can get away with 200 an hour, great,
But if someone can only afford 50, they're the wrong client.
Yeah.
Don't take them on for the sake of it.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, if you're not measuring this stuff, then you don't know. So
Exactly.
That's the thing. A lot of people are just flying blind, like my friend here, who
Shotgun.
you can't go, well, $90 an hour feels good, if you don't know, right? You've got to measure that stuff. And I think we measured some of it. We probably could have done a lot more back in the day.
Yeah.
I think we measure stuff like that a lot better now. Being data-driven. Data. Okay, now, I hope you like that. I'm very excited now to go into the next part. This is going to be part one of a two-part interview with my mentor. You're just waiting for me to say it, aren't you? Okay, now hold on for the interview with Paul Boag! I'm extremely honored to welcome Paul Boag to the show. Now, Paul has been a digital consultant for over 20 years. He's written 4 published books and spoken at conferences like South by Southwest and Future of Web Design. Paul co-founded Headscape, a digital agency based in the UK, and is also the host of one of the most popular web design podcasts, Boagworld, which also happened to be my inspiration for this podcast. So thank you so much for being on our show today, Paul.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure, but I certainly haven't been a consultant for 20 years because I used to actually work for a living. Consultants don't actually do anything, do they? I hasten to add that being a consultant is a relatively new addition to my life. I used to actually be a designer once upon a time.
Yes, that's right. That's right. But I suppose you consulted while you designed, didn't you?
Yeah, I guess so. That sounds okay. Yeah, all right. Let's go for that.
Okay, well, I'm gonna try not to sound too much of a fanboy, but I remember years ago telling Kevin that one day I'd like to have Proposify mentioned on Boagworld. This is just when it was brand new, before we had anything, and then one day we had several customers emailing us saying that you recommended us to them without us even having to bother you. And, we were just completely over the moon when we saw that you had posted a link to us.
Oh, well, it's a great app, isn't it? And I don't know where I found it from. I must have stumbled across it somewhere along the line. And writing proposals sucks so much. You waste so much time doing it, don't you? And so anything that can help with that is wonderful. And being able to, the bit I like most about Proposify is being able to see whether people have actually read the proposal or not. Because I swear to you that the amount of time I've been, you send a proposal out and then you wait and you wait and you wait and you think, do I chase them? When do I chase them? Is it too early to? And all the rest of it. But no, it's brilliant. Brilliant app.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, we don't want to turn it into an ad for Proposify, but I mean, it's funny because it's sort of a recent category of software, isn't it? You haven't seen it seems like only in the last few years I've noticed anyway a lot more proposal apps coming out, whereas before there wasn't really anything.
And it makes so much sense, doesn't it? I mean, use it. It's a reoccurring trend you're seeing at the moment. Like, for example, for years, everybody used Photoshop, right? Photoshop was this go-to app, but then it got so large and so bloated, and also our requirements became more and more specific, that actually Photoshop turned into this app that was trying to be a photographer's app. It was trying to be a print designer's app, a web designer's app, etc., etc. And almost the same thing has happened with things like Word or InDesign, that these are tools that are these kind of big behemoth generic tools that try and do everything for everyone. And so they tend to not be very good at doing anything for anybody as a result. It's like a hammer to crack a nut. But then you get a really simple tool like Proposify that's focused. It's focused on producing one thing and doing one thing well. And it enables it to be much more streamlined. So it's like Proposify is the equivalent of Sketch for web designers. That all these web designers have abandoned Photoshop as this big clunky tool that isn't specific to their needs and started using something like Sketch, which is designed specifically for the job that they do. And so, and in my mind, Proposify is like that. If you're someone that writes a lot of proposals, you need a tool that is tailored for doing specifically that job. That's my kind of view on it.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I think that becomes the challenge scaling a software company is because a lot of people start out with this really specific thing. Like you use the example of Photoshop. It started out as a tool for photographers, and then you get feature requests and thousands of customers going, but I wanted to do this and that, and it becomes a job of saying no, and people don't like you for it.
No, absolutely. And, you get stuffed either way. But I think I'd be tempted to, if I got into that kind of situation, for example, in your situation, you could say, well, actually, Proposify is really good for writing any kind of document. Why does it need to be just for proposals? And so you start adding in more features that, enable you to write other kinds of documents in it and support the kind of things that you need for that. But actually, you're almost better at that point either going, no, this is what we do, or splitting it into two products. Instead of trying to create one product that does everything. At least that's my opinion.
Yeah, we kind of followed the rework book from 37 Signals. That was less is more, and staying focused on what we do best.
But we are tempted to add a contract and presentations feature to it as well.
Yeah, and I can understand that. And it's really hard to strike the balance, isn't it? And because even within something just like proposal writing, there are different people that have got very different requirements. So, for example, when I worked at the agency that we're going to talk about later called Headscape, I founded an agency with a couple of other people. We used to do a huge amount of, quite dry proposal writing in the sense of, it was going through proper tender processes and, you had to submit the document in a certain way. So in that kind of environment, Proposify was absolutely perfect because it produced these documents that created great PDFs, and you could send the PDFs through, and that's really what the client wanted as much as anything else. And then they'd go and when it got handed around, they'd go and look at the online version, but they needed that piece piece of paper as well. Now I've gone as an independent consultant. It's a completely different world for me. They just care about the online version. They don't care about the PDF. And so suddenly, the emphasis has shifted from something that's very one set of requirements to another. So even within something as narrow as just proposal writing, you can still end up with lots of different requirements. It's a never-ending battle, basically, of requirements and features.
Yeah, it never ends. Okay, so I want to talk about you a little bit more. I've mentioned before that I was a long-time listener of the podcast. Has it been 10 years since you started?
Oh, over that now.
Over that.
I think, I don't know. No, it must be about 10 years. It would have been, I went to the first ever web standards conference in the UK called App Media in 2005. And as I was looking around the room, there were all these cool bloggers, and I went, wow, I want to be like them. I want to be cool and, and well known and everybody to love me. Yeah, I was young and idealistic. What can I say? So I then went away and started a blog immediately after that. So that was 2005. And then I discovered that writing a blog is hard work, and that I'm, as is already apparent from this show, better at talking, and I do a lot of it. So that's where I started the podcast, which would have been about 2006. Yeah,
I remember first hearing about Twitter from listening to the podcast on my way to work.
Yeah,
that's got to be 2007, 8, or something like that.
Yeah, that would have been. I was introduced to Twitter at my first ever international conference. The first conference I got invited to abroad to speak at. And a few people, Jeremy Keith and Andy Budd, were both there speaking, and they just heard about Twitter. So yeah, that would have been very early days. That was before they took off at South by Southwest.
Wow.
I remember having a long chat with I can't even remember the guys' names that founded Twitter. Because they were this tiny little startup, so we're desperate to speak to anyone.
Yeah. Oh, was it
these days?
Biz Stone?
Yeah, Biz Stone, that's it. That was the name I was looking for. And Ethan somebody or other, isn't it, I think?
Oh,
Biz Stone, though, what a name. Biz Stone.
I know, that's cool. Although I knew a guy once called, I still know him, a guy called Rich Quick.
I used to know Joe Power.
That's pretty cool, too.
That was pretty cool. I mean, so, I guess when I say that Boagworld was our inspiration for this podcast, it's really because I've always loved the relaxed sort of conversational approach to it. Just a bit of irreverence. And the sort of banter between you and Marcus. I find that podcasts nowadays are very, almost overly tight and professional sounding. I mean, was that kind of your design choice?
What you're saying is that we're not professional. You do realise you deeply insulted me just then.
I gathered the same thing. Come on, Kyle, that's not nice. Insulting our guest?
You know what I mean. Okay.
I do. I know absolutely what you mean.
Clinical. Clinical is the word I was looking for.
Yeah. I know what you mean. It's fine. Don't worry. Yes, I guess. The kind of mantra... the template for me goes back to that first conference. Do you remember the one I said that inspired me to start blogging? The bit I enjoyed most of that conference, and indeed every conference I've ever been to since, is not the speakers, but it's the sitting around chatting afterwards. Sitting in a pub, having a pint, chatting away. And that was what we wanted to recreate on the podcast. And sometimes it's easier than others. Once you start getting guests on it, you guys know this. You feel like you suddenly have got to be a bit more professional and grown up about it. So that's why the episodes I like the most is where it's just me, Marcus, and people that we know personally, because they tend to be the most fun, although probably not the most informative.
Well, at least you know them well, so you can, have a go at them, and you can't do that as much with perfect strangers, right?
Absolutely, it's all ultimately to do with being rude to one another. Yeah, people. The ruder I am to Marcus, and the ruder Marcus is to me, the happier people seem to be. I mean, basically, the other, I said compare it to, sitting in a pub. Probably a more accurate description is just a really old, bitter married couple. I think that really sums up our relationship.
Yeah, that sounds about perfect. It almost sometimes reminds me, and maybe is it a British thing? It's like, Ricky Gervais and Carl Pilkington, how it's just his job to just make fun of Carl. If
I could be even 0.5% as funny as Ricky Gervais, that would be wonderful. But unfortunately, I'm not. So just have to survive making podcasts on web design.
Well, I think
it's not really The Office, is it?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it's more Carl anyway. That's he's the funniest part of that.
Oh, he is hilarious, that guy. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, when looking back at the podcast and how long you've been doing it, I mean, I guess how do you feel in terms of how important it was to your career, or do you have any regrets, or just feel like there was missed opportunities, or you just kind of, feel it was incredibly important to where you are now?
It's really funny. I tweeted just this morning that I believe that success has far more to do with grasping opportunities than it has to do with talent. And I believe that from my own experience, really, because, academically at school, I was lucky if I was average. I wasn't good at school. I'm not the most talented designer in the world. I'm not particularly a specialist in anything, but I've had some amazing opportunities just kind of fall in my lap. And the first one was very much the podcast, because what happened essentially is I got an iPod, the first iPod that supported podcasting. So I went along to iTunes to look up web design podcasts, and there weren't any. But there were podcasts on knitting, which I found deeply insulting. That we were supposed to be early adopters, and there was nothing on web design. So I started so I just thought, well, I'll have a go then. And I was shit. If you listen to the first few, they're absolutely abysmal. The sound quality's terrible. It was just me. They're just awful. But there was no competition. So, I monopolized the market. So if you gave any kind of, if you cared in the slightest about web design, you had no choice but to listen to me. But which worked out great, so the podcast grew very quickly. And inevitably, before long, that led to that speaking opportunity that I mentioned, which was my first foray into speaking, and so that opened up another door, and so then you speak at a few conferences, and you don't suck too badly, and so you get invited to other ones. And of course, people are sheep. If one conference organizer sees, one conference inviting you, then they think, oh, well, he must be a good person. We'll invite him to ours. And so, there's no kind of quality control in this in any way. It's just people blindly following other people. And then inevitably, but that then spills onto another thing. So one day out of the blue, I get this email saying, we see that you're a figure in web design, right? Because apparently I spoke at a few conferences, therefore I'm a figure in web design. Would you write a book? So yeah, sure, I'll do that. And then you've written a book, and then suddenly it doesn't matter what the quality of the book is, and whether it's a good book or not. Just the fact that you're a published author gives you kudos, right? And so before you know it, you're considered an expert in the field, all because you got frustrated that there were only podcasts on knitting.
Now, I know you're very humble and self-deprecating, and that's the English way, and to a larger part the Canadian way as well. But obviously the quality has to be there. You can only fool people for so long, so you must have been doing something right.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I've always been a reasonably good public speaker. I have learnt to become a good writer. I wasn't a good writer at all. I think you can learn most of this stuff. It's more. I'm a great believer in saying yes to things and then working out how you're going to do them. So I think yes, there is a degree of skill that's involved, but skill can be learnt.
Yeah.
Opportunity and seeing opportunity and grasping that opportunity, and that's a tricky one. That's harder to do, and it's harder. Whether it would be really interesting to see what would happen if I relived my career now. If I joined the web design now today. Whether in 20 years' time I would have the standing that I have now, or whether I am a product of timing, that I hit the web when it was first taking off, that I hit podcasting when it first took off. That's what I guess I'm getting at. I'm reasonably good at what I do, but I think a lot of it was down to just timing, really.
I mean, that's an impossible question to answer, right? Like I've heard people say that about the Beatles. If it was it the time period and just the culture that made the Beatles what they were, or was it it's everything. It's all those opportunities and talent put together, and you can't.
Yeah. And there's also an element whereby the Beatles shaped what came afterwards, and so we judge the Beatles by today's standards, which have been shaped by the Beatles, if that makes sense. So there's this kind of circular thing where culture is affected by individuals and individuals are affected by culture. This is getting very deep, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
I got to get back to what you said about grasping opportunities, though, because that's kind of how I lived my life. I've been an entrepreneur most of my career. I'm in my 50s now.
And both of us sucked at school, too.
As well. Yep.
I do think there's a relationship between sucking at school and having an entrepreneurial nature.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. I mean, I think I opened my first business at 24, not much experience, just went for it. You have to. I love that. That's bang on for me.
Yeah, I never really described myself as an entrepreneur. I guess I am. I've got this image in my head of entrepreneurs as being these super driven people that set up stuff and build stuff and exit, and have this kind of perpetual cycle of creating things. And I'm not that. I'm somebody that I've always wanted to build lifestyle businesses. I've always wanted to build a business that facilitates what I want to do in my life, rather than having a desire to build things for building things' sake. That's not what excites me. And the only reason I go from creating one thing to the next thing is really because I change my mind about what I want out of life. And so I then go on and do it slightly differently, in a different way, in a different context. So I don't know whether that makes me an entrepreneur or not, but I certainly couldn't work for anyone else. I know that. Not that anyone would hire me these days, I don't think.
Well, I think that alone makes you an entrepreneur. As soon as you can't be hired anymore because you just don't want to listen to a boss, then you're an entrepreneur.
Oh, okay, is that the way it works? Fair enough, then I am.
And I think as long as you're not living in a gutter at the same time. So you make a living for yourself and you can't be hired, you're an entrepreneur, in my opinion.
But then don't you think basically this whole idea of working for someone else, getting a job and working for someone else for your entire working career is increasingly going to go away anyway? I look at certainly in our sector, and I think, more and more it's going to be people coming together for a short period of time to work on a particular thing, and then they go off and do their own thing with someone else. And it's much more fluid than it used to be in the past. And I think that's only going to ever grow, in my opinion.
Well, this kind of brings me to another question, which is, you've had, when we talk about big figures in web design, you've had probably the biggest names there are. I'll kind of list off a few of them for the listeners. So and by all means, let me know if there's more. I mean, Mark Bolton, Andy Clark, Jeffrey Zeldman, Jeremy Keefe, Ethan Marcotte, Molly Hochschlag, if I got her name correctly. I mean, this basically is, you don't get bigger in the web design business than that. And you've, from what I understand, have personal relationships with some of these people. They've been guests on your show. I mean, I guess the point is, not all these people are entrepreneurs, by the way.
No.
they've been able to attain this sort of influencer status, and some of them still work at agencies or they, work at institutions. I mean, I guess what's your thoughts, maybe just based on what we were talking about, on the relationship between being a notable public figure and being an entrepreneur?
I don't think the two are directly linked in any way, shape, or form. I think being a notable figure is about being willing to express an opinion. That's all it basically comes down to. There are a lot of more talented people out there than the ones you've just listed. Those people, all the people you've just listed would quite happily agree with me over that. The difference is that those people actively stood up for something. They actively, started sharing their experiences, started sharing what they did. Jeffrey Seldman and the Web Standards Movement, Molly Holschlag and the W3C. You got Andy Clark and groundbreaking CSS techniques, Ethan Marcotte with responsive design, and so it goes on. So it's more a willingness. A lot of people are really afraid to stick their head above the parapet because they know that they will get a backlash, and they will. And you will be told you're stupid and boring and wrong and all those kinds of things. But if you're able to ignore that kind of stuff and recognize that, the internet's a big place and a lot of people won't agree with you, and that'll still leave a hell of a lot of people that will, then yeah, you can begin to build a reputation and a career. So it's a willingness to speak more than anything else.
I think people have a big fear of getting started. I know I did for many years, and I still probably hold back in a lot of ways from what I want to say and write about. But it's that fear of I'm not saying anything new. There's nothing that I can add that hasn't already been said by smarter people and more eloquently.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. And there is nothing new that you can add. The truth is whatever you choose to talk about, someone has talked about it before. The reason to share and express your opinion is that you will have a slightly different take on it, and that you will. You may explain it in a way that for some people that is more accessible. So for a long time, probably less so now because I've moved into much more kind of specialist, cutting edge stuff. But for a long time in the beginning days when my blog grew probably the fastest actually, and the podcast, I was essentially taking what those smart people you've just listed were saying and rephrasing it and rewording it and representing it in a more accessible way to my audience, the people that were coming to me. I had a way of, Jeremy Keith, for example. Jeremy Keith is one of the smartest guys I know, right? But he is so smart sometimes that no normal human being can understand what he's getting at. And it sometimes all it takes is someone to explain that again. And a lot of the time when I was blogging in the early days, I was literally taking stuff I was learning and writing it down in my own words, as much for me to understand what I have just learned as to communicate to anybody else. But as it turned out, there were a lot of people that actually appreciated that, that process. And so they read it and they enjoyed it. So I think sometimes you've almost got to forget your audience and just write for you, write for explaining things to yourself, and you'll find that other people will find that useful too.
And then you, of course, through writing it, you learn it better. To teach something, you need to understand it, and therefore you enhance your own knowledge and skills, and therefore eventually have something very unique and original to say.
Yeah, and I mean that's why I got into the whole thing of inviting guests onto the podcast was I was struggling with some aspects. Say, for example, when Ethan Marcotte first started introduced responsive design, and I've got to confess I really didn't get it. I didn't understand it. So I invited him on the podcast to explain it to me. It's great. It's such a great way of learning because you could just get someone to explain it. And then through that, I kind of worked it out and integrated it into my own workflow and then shared it with other people. And so it goes on.
No, I mean, by the point that responsive design came about, I mean, Boagworld was already a very established show. But I mean, when it comes to these sort of big names in the industry, when you approach them or do they approach you, I mean, I guess, for somebody out there starting, or maybe they haven't been doing it too long, I guess, what approach would you take if you had to start over of you want to get sort of more established people on your show, but you're afraid to kind of ask?
Yeah, it's a really difficult one because the answer is actually really simple, right? The answer is just ask them. Because all of these people, all those people that I listed, are normal human beings. There's nothing special about them. And in fact, take, for example, Andy Clark. I'll pick on Andy Clark because I know Andy Clark very, very well now. He's a good friend. I know that Andy Clark struggles to run his little agency exactly the same way as I do, exactly the same way as anybody else does. I mentor a lot of people, right? Mm-hmm. And I, as part of that mentorship, I get an inside look at every conceivable size of agency you could imagine, and we all struggle with the same problems. So Andy Clark needs to, it doesn't think that he's anything special. He doesn't believe that he's some superstar, and so you can approach someone like him and ask him on the show, and he won't think it's beneath him. He won't think you're annoying him. It's all in our own heads. But that said, I'm just as bad as anybody else over this. You might. I'm gonna sound like a complete jackass now, but you might have felt slightly weird coming to me. I
did.
Yeah, you said in your introduction you were honoured that I was on the show, right? I really struggled not to laugh at that point, but the truth is that you may look at me and respect me, but I'm looking at someone else with that same kind of awe and slight trepidation, and it's this circle of there's no point of looking up to anyone, is what I'm saying here, because every person is looking up to someone else. Like, I'm in awe of Jeffrey Zeldman. Right. Yeah. I've had him on the podcast. I was terrified before he came on the podcast, because for me, he was such a big influence and such a big factor. When I first met Andy Budd and Jeremy Keith, I was almost at the point of not being able to speak, which for me is a huge thing. But now these guys, I'm terribly rude to both of them all the time because they've become good friends, because I've discovered this magical thing that they're just human beings. Yet there are some people that I still have never got over it with. Merlin Mann. Do you know Merlin Mann, the productivity guy?
No.
So Merlin Mann is somebody that I'm in total awe of Merlin Mann, right? And I had an opportunity to go and say hello to him, and I chickened out.
Well, good to know it happens for you too.
Yeah, it happens to everybody. It's that kind of, oh no, it's Merlin Mann sitting over there. I want to say hello, and how much and he would have. I know he would have really appreciated it if I'd gone over and said, Merlin, I just want to say I love your stuff. It's been hugely beneficial to me. Thank you. He would have loved it. I know he would, because I know that he'll get loads of people telling him how crap he is. Right. So go find whoever it is you respect the most in the industry, and just send them an email, tweet them, whatever. Thank them for what they're doing.
Wow, that's good advice.
How you feeling after that interview?
That was great. Yeah, I'm not used to hearing Paul Boag's voice on our podcast.
I know. You've got that poster of him on your wall in your bedroom.
He's a handsome man.
Yes, he is.
Handsome bloke, as some might say.
Bloke.
No, that was awesome. I mean, there was so much meat in that interview that, we don't want to sort of pack it into this big, giant, long episode. So we're going to split this up. So, the first part you would have just heard, Paul talked a lot about building his personal brand and the podcast and how he's met all these great influencers and how you can kind of do it too. And then next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about agency stuff and him running Headscape and issues, some problems that they've had, and the future of agencies. So look out for that next week. In the meantime, if you have a question, please let us know. Email Kyle or Kevin at proposify.biz. That's 2 separate email addresses. And we'll see you next week for the next interview with Paul Boag. All right, see you, Kevin.
Later.